You're listening to How We Got Here. I'm Chris McClellan, and I'm joined by my favorite co-host, Christina Bess. And if you like today's conversation, and why wouldn't you, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing our podcast wherever you get your podcast.
I'm so honored to be your favorite. Also, the audience should know that I do write our little intro scripts, so I may be I'm supplementing your compliments to me. Although I'm sure you could come up with some great compliments of your own without my help.
I mean, I would have figured that one out on my own. You didn't need to write it, but I did ad-lib a little bit in that in that script.
I liked it. I liked the ad-lib. We're all about an ad-lib moment. Well,
Well, that's because, in caregiving, you have to ad-lib from time to time.
I'm really excited about today's guest because she's more or less a member of our big caregiving.com family. Brenda Blais Nesbitt is with us. And Chris, I'm going to go ahead and let you do the honors of telling everyone about this lovely person.
Well, I appreciate that, but I have to add also that I'm excited too because she is from Canada and I'm half Canadian.
I had no idea.
So that's exciting.
Half Canadian.
You had no idea? My father was born in Prince Edward Island, Canada, and I'm very, very proud of my Canadian roots. So, but let's move on here. Brenda Blais Nesbitt is a warrior mom from her amazing daughter, Nikki, whom she has cared for over 28 years. She is the founder and president of Coaching for Caregivers Canada, a coaching organization specializing in providing support and guidance to caregivers whose needs are often overlooked in their caregiving journey. She is the host of Caregiving.com's Caring Conversation podcast, which follows the journey of having a child with disabilities from diagnosis through their many transitions into adult life. So, Brenda, welcome, but how did you get here?
Well, thank you, Chris and Christina. It's a pleasure to be here. How did I get here? That's a loaded question.
Yes, it is.
You mentioned that I am mom to Nikki, my daughter, who still lives at home with me. Nikki wasn't breathing when she was born. And as a result, she can't walk, talk, or feed herself. She's very medically complex as well. Now, despite not being able to breathe when she was born, the doctors one doctor in particular was quite certain that she would have no suffering effects from that. But as it turned out, he was quite wrong. She suffered global brain damage. So pretty much meaning all parts of her brain were deprived of oxygen and could not function to be able to allow her to walk, talk, or feed herself. In the beginning, she was just like any other baby, except she screamed constantly. It was very overwhelming to manage. A lot of seizures as well, a lot of trips to the hospital, a lot of the unknown. Fortunately, I actually worked at the hospital here where I live as a medical office administration, so I was quite familiar with the medical terminology. But having it applied to yourself and applying all those terms to your baby was a different thing. But I think it even goes further back from before Nikki was born. And I didn't actually realize this. I realized it, but I didn't self-identify as a caregiver to my brother when I was really young. And as you know, siblings are often overlooked in the caregiving journey. And it wasn't until I was listening to your podcast with Aisha that it hit me. I was born into a family of 8. So I was the youngest of 8. And the next oldest to me was 7 years older than I am. And he was premature. So he suffered a lot of physical disabilities when he was younger. Well, and still does. But I just basically grew up with that. So that was just a part of my being when I grew up. So I didn't self-identify as a caregiver. Now, being a young toddler and a young child, you don't consider yourself a caregiver. But I remember times that he would have a grand mal seizure and I would have to run to my mom. So, in that kind of essence, or help my mom, turn him onto his side, things like that. So that kind of activity I didn't realize at that time. And I didn't realize until I listened to your other guest that I actually was playing a role as a caregiver in my brother's life at a very young age. And many siblings do that. Siblings who are born into it, they just grow up with it. It's a part of their lives. It's not that they feel that they're caregiving. They're just being a sibling, looking out for their sibling. And then when I was 9 years old, my dad had a stroke. And that completely changed our whole life dynamics and family dynamics as well, because he was the breadwinner and the one who took care of everybody. So all of a sudden, we had to fill those roles for him and take care of him. So I'd say I've had a lifetime of caregiving.
A lifetime of caregiving. Wow. I don't think out of all the podcasts I've done and talking to people across the globe, it's the first time anybody has ever said that to me. A lifetime of caregiving.
Wow. And my mom did too. My mom grew up with a sibling who was disabled. She had 8 kids, and one of them being disabled, and then her husband having a stroke. So she had a long lifetime of caregiving.
Do you recall from childhood, what that dynamic was like between, specifically you and your mom and your role as, the caregiver support? I know you mentioned when your brother would have seizures, you would go to her, but I'd love to hear a little more about what you remember from the role you played as her support system.
I think there were still more siblings at home with my brother. I remember 2 older siblings for sure still being at home. So they probably played more of a role. And my oldest sister, she played a big role in helping my mom as well. Now, she had her first child a year before I was born. So I was born an aunt. And her children were more like my siblings than my niece and nephew, because we were all the same age. But with my dad, when he had his stroke, there was for sure a lot more support that I gave my mom. And a lot of it was sadly related to emotional protection. My dad was very cognitively, not cognitively, but emotionally affected by his stroke. High temper runs in his family. He had a high temper. We grew up in the era where it was common to be disciplined with a belt. And once he had his stroke, his temper just got even worse. My mom had a really tough time struggling with that. And so did we. My dad was also a World War II vet, landed on Juno Beach 4 days after D-Day. And I have no doubt in my mind that he suffered from PTSD when it was not recognized, when there was no help for it. And he's one of those who didn't start talking about it until 70 years later. So now that I understand that more, now I understand my dad more from that time of his life. But supporting my mom she really had a difficult time getting away from her duties. So even at times after I moved away from home, my sisters and I would do our best to try and take her out shopping, take her out for a meal, do what we could to give her a break when we could. And then I moved provinces away from them, but I continued to advocate for them. And I would often go out there there was a time my mom had a very scary medical incident happen, and she was in the hospital, and that left my dad at home. He didn't know how to cook. I ended up arranging care for my daughter last minute, flying out there, and really advocating for my mom before I got out there on the phone with the surgeon and after I got out there. There's a lot of us in the family, and a lot are closer to where they lived, but I was definitely the best one for the advocating, understanding the system very intimately, a lot more intimately than my other siblings.
So not only have you been a caregiver most of your life, you've been an advocate as well.
Very much so. I've been an advocate all of Nikki's life for sure, and an advocate out of province for my parents and my brother.
And don't the two roles kind of go hand in hand?
What do you mean by that?
Advocacy and caregiving.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. 100%. One doesn't come without the other, I don't think. And, some people might not be comfortable with the advocacy aspect of it. It can be very intimidating. And I was very intimidated in the beginning. Very intimidated. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I was comfortable doing it. And I still have moments where you feel like, oh, what's gonna happen if I do this? Or if I make too big of a stink, will I have a mark against me? Fortunately, I've been seen as a very articulate and passionate advocate. And I also know what battles to choose, what battles to let go of, and what battles to choose. And then the other really important aspect is when things do go really well, making sure you recognize that, not just within yourself, but the other parties that were involved.
So I want to take a step back and talk more about Nikki and your journey specifically with her, and maybe we can touch on some of those moments where you were either forced to or recognized that you needed to find your voice and become her advocate.
Sure, I'd love to. I did not realize how much negativity surrounded our lives until Nikki was about 2.5 years old. And I had to take her to the dentist. Yet another health professional, yet another appointment. And without realizing it, you get anxious. You get almost defensive because and exhausted because you're going to have to go through the whole history and all the meds and everything again with somebody else. But the experience with that dentist is one 26 years later I'm still talking about because it had such a profound impact on me. The way he examined Nikki blew my mind. The way he talked to her, even though she was only 2.5, and dealt with me was amazing. But after he examined her, he said to me, "She's perfect. Keep up the good work." And I thought I heard him wrong, and I was stunned, and I had to ask him to repeat himself. So he did. He said it again. She's perfect. Keep up the good work. It took every ounce of energy not to burst into tears, not to jump up and give him a hug and a kiss right there in front of the office of patients and staff. And once I got my daughter buckled into her car seat in the van, I got in the driver's seat, and before I drove away, I just bawled. Because it hit me in that moment that not one health professional in that 2.5 years had ever said anything positive about my daughter. It was all about what she couldn't do, what she would never be able to do, the milestone she wasn't reaching. And her cute little personality was starting to emerge around this time too. And she wasn't screaming and crying as much. And she was getting those cute little belly laughs and squeals of glee and oohs and ahs. And every time that happened, I just wanted to celebrate that. But then I would go to a doctor's appointment and I would be reminded about everything that is quote unquote wrong. And I just wanted to scream and yell that there's nothing wrong. So that this dentist almost gave me permission to celebrate everything that she can do and everything that she can give. And she may not be able to talk, but she can sure fill a room with infectious joy with her smiles and her laughs. And you cannot help but smile when you see her smile. I have care workers who might be off for a few days in a row, and they'll come in and say, "Oh, Nikki, I missed you so much. I missed your smile. Your smile makes everything so much better." So I choose to celebrate all of that. Yes, there's all this other stuff going on in the background, but I always have to bring myself back to remembering that I have to celebrate and take joy in those special moments with her. It's been a really long, hard journey. It's been messy. I have had a number of situations where, if you want to get back to examples, around that same time with the dentist, we had a neurologist who I felt wasn't listening. She was suffering from a lot of seizures. He put her on a med we were scared of. We got a second opinion with that. He got angry at the second opinion. So finally, I built up the courage to ask for another neurologist, and he was quite offended by that and quite combative, actually. And it was unnerving. It was very unnerving, but it did give me the validation that he wasn't meeting my needs, my daughter's needs, and we needed somebody who was going to. So I stood firm on that, but Nikki was only 2. I was 25, and I was just starting off into this world of, I don't know how to deal with a doctor who is not going to listen to me, because I grew up with my parents in the era that doctors knew everything. They're God. You trust them. They know it all. You do what they say. And I was coming to realize with Nikki that that wasn't the case. That I was developing my own expertise in my daughter. And sometimes I felt very unheard or unseen, or even worse, treated as, how would she possibly know? She's too young to know. But it's really, really key to connect with doctors who are on the same page with you, who will listen to you, who will trust your instinct. And there was a time that my daughter was extremely critically ill in the pediatric ICU. She was 15. She had been riddled with pancreatitis attacks since she was 12. We had no idea what was causing them. She is fed by a feeding tube, so it's not like she could sneak liquor out of the liquor cabinet. And the resident on an overnight that I was staying overnight through, and she wanted to restart Nikki's feeds. She had been off of feeds because of the illness that she was battling. She was a very, very precariously ill on a ventilator. I was uncomfortable because I knew her pancreas level was increasing. And you treat pancreatitis with gut rest. So we made a compromise. I said if her blood work was lowered in the middle of the night, if her level was lower, then I would agree to feeds being started. But if it was higher, I'd prefer we held off a little bit longer. So I walked in the next morning, saw her feed pump running, and I was, yes. And the nurse looked at me with this solemn look on her face and shook her head no. And that made me quite upset because I felt like she didn't pull through on her end of the compromise. And that wasn't affecting me. It was affecting my daughter. And the mama bear's instinct comes in, right? So I asked the nurse for a water flush, flushed her tube, turned it off, and asked for the gastro to come down and consult. And when he did later on in the day, he came with his team of students, and I gave him what happened. He looked at me and he said, Brenda, good call. And then he looked at his students and he said to them, never, ever underestimate a mother's instinct. So for me, it's been really key to get involved with physicians who get that. We had a very recent experience with a procedure. My daughter required an anesthetic. And I asked in pre-admit for the anesthesiologist who knows her best. What's the worst thing that can happen? He's not available or they say no. But to my surprise, he showed up the next day. And he was the anesthesiologist who handled the procedure for my daughter. We had a long discussion about whether or not to intubate her or to do the laryngeal mask, which is less invasive. She's got a lot of respiratory issues. And I said to him, you know what? I trust your judgment. You do what's best for Nikki. It was a procedure that took an hour and a half to 2 hours. He said if he intubated her, she would have a much more difficult recovery. And after the procedure, when I was talking to the doctor, he said to me, he was so incredulous. He said, Brenda, he didn't intubate her. He sat there and bagged her the whole time. Now, if I didn't ask for that anesthesiologist, she probably would have been intubated. And that anesthesiologist did what was best for Nikki, not what was easiest for him. Mm. That is the epitome of patient-centered care. And that made the world of difference in my daughter's recovery. And that needs recognition. So when things like that happen, you have to follow up with a letter. I am working on the letter right now. And recognizing not just to the doctor himself, but to his superiors, to corporate communications within the hospital. We often recognize all of the negatives that happen, and not the positives. And I think that goes back to the dentist, right? Reminding me that, yes, let's focus on the positives.
It sounds like that mindset has been key for your journey as a caregiver and as a long-term caregiver for your daughter.
Yes, and it came to my mind, what really empowered me was when Nikki was 16. She had had another intensive care unit stay, and she was moved out of intensive care onto the pediatric floor. She seemed to be getting worse, and I was quite concerned, and the doctors were very, very resistant to ordering blood work. They were poking her anyway. So let's order some blood work to follow these levels, because I know when she gets like this, it's typically these levels that we need to watch. But for some reason, the doctors were extremely resistant. Now, here in Canada, of course, our healthcare is paid for. And that tends to be a little bit of a barrier sometimes, because they don't want to order more tests than what they think might be necessary, because it costs the system. Whereas in the US, if you're paying for it, then they're a little bit more amenable to that. But I was really frustrated because I really felt like they weren't listening. So long story short, I ended up having a meeting with the team. And I said, listen, I don't know where we've gotten off the rails here, but you're so resistant to what we're asking for. And I don't understand why. Like, do you feel like I'm stepping on your toes? Do you feel like I'm trying to direct Nikki's care too much? And I said, I don't want you to feel that way. I'm not a doctor. I'm relying on you for your medical expertise. But there's one thing here I need you to respect. I need you to respect that I know my daughter better than any one of you. I've studied her. Most of the team were residents or medical students. So I said, I have studied her longer than you've been in school. And I am the only one in this room with a PhD in Nikkiology. So I said, I need you to value that. And it went over really well. And that was super empowering for me. I knew I could deal with those doctors again because I let them know how they made me feel. And if you're upset with a doctor and you don't let them know how you make them feel, it's so hard to do. My heart was racing.
Absolutely.
Right.
But yet, if we don't let them know how they made us feel, how are they going to do anything to fix that? And those who want to fix it
continues. It just continues if it's not addressed, then the relationship in and of itself just kind of continues to deteriorate.
Yes,
and,
yes, absolutely.
You hit it head on. You met it head on.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to the communication style too. If people want to look up I and you messages, you messages put people on the defensive right away. So if you say, you're making me feel unheard, you can say, I feel unheard. Nobody can fault you for the way you feel. Mm-hmm. So it's really practicing, not saying like, you're not hearing me. I feel unheard. I feel unimportant in this team. And here's something else that I really promote. Who is the most important member of the team? Think about that. Is it your family doctor? Is it the specialist for your condition? I see you shaking your head. No, Chris.
No.
No, but none of the listeners can't see that. I can see it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you know where I'm going?
I know exactly where you're going, and it's right on. It's right on target. You are
the most important member of the team.
Yeah, you're the CEO.
I say I'm the janitor to the CEO of my daughter's team.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
If you're the patient, you're the most important, obviously. But in my daughter's case, where she can't speak, where she can't direct her care, obviously she's still the most important member, but I speak for her. I'm her voice. Mm-hmm. And now I've studied her for 28 years. So I don't know. Can you have a PhD cubed?
I think so.
And, you know, there's a lot to say about medical research. And I used to work for doctors, and a lot of focus is put on research, evidence. And not always, but some of the anecdotal evidence is dismissed because it's not studied and it's not evidenced and researched and written in a medical journal and restudied to validate it. But when my daughter was really, really ill, when she was 15 in ICU, I told those doctors time and time again, like, this is how you need to deal with this, and lay off, hands off. She will fight this, like, stop stressing so much over all of this. And it was extremely stressful. Don't get me wrong. It was probably one of the worst times in our lives. And I thought she was going to die on Mother's Day that year. And that's a whole other aspect of caring for her, but we'll stay on this topic for now. I said to them, you know what? Sometimes with Nikki, you just need to throw out your medical books because she's written her own. And near the end of her stay, I walked into the ICU, and the head of the ICU was leaning up against her doorway with his arms crossed, just kind of shaking his head slightly, just looking at her in awe. And I walked up to him and I said, is there something wrong? He said, no, Brenda. He said, you're absolutely right. She's written her own book.
Right.
So some pretty impactful moments with her over her life.
Because sometimes the book has to be thrown away because it doesn't apply to every case, every situation.
True.
And you're demonstrating that.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot about that in my own journey as someone living with a chronic condition. I think often about the fact that it's like, I am the expert in what I'm living with. And I'm, you know, as a side note, still trying to figure out my own voice and advocating for myself in healthcare settings. But I think it speaks to what we've been talking about the last couple of minutes is like, you as Nikki's mother, you are the expert in her condition and her day-to-day life. And that anecdotal evidence, I think can often be much more impactful when care teams are willing to hear it and then validate it too.
Yeah. It's absolutely funny that you talk about living with a chronic condition, because that's a good segue into
I set you up
something
there.
I'd like to share as well about myself. I not only have a child who's severely disabled and medically complex, but for the last 14 years, I've also been living with a chronic condition. And for the listeners, if you feel like I sound like I'm out of breath or nervous, or for those in the medical community, you might recognize a little bit of stridor. It's not nervousness. It's actually an airway condition I have, and it's called idiopathic subglottic stenosis. It is a narrowing of my airway, and I have to go in for repeated dilatations of my airway, which requires surgery, anesthetic, and what have you. I was misdiagnosed for 2.5 years. And that was a time of really having to learn how to advocate for myself, because I was used to advocating for Nikki. And I was misdiagnosed with asthma. And then on further investigation, I was misdiagnosed by a doctor saying that it was caused by stress because I have a disabled child. And it takes a lot for doctors, my own specialists, new specialists in particular, to get out of me that I have a disabled child, because I don't want them to overlook anything physiological as a cause, knowing that, because that's often what they do. But that's what happened. Luckily, I have a really good family doctor who listens to me and continued to pursue a diagnosis. It took 2.5 years. And then it became very, very scary for me because I had to sign a consent for surgery to dilate my airway with signing for a trach if I needed one. And I was like, how do I take care of my daughter if I have a trach? Now, fortunately, none of my surgeries have required that, but that's always a risk. And in the first 5 years, I had 5 surgeries. And then I went an amazing 6.5 years without an airway surgery. And I thought I beat it, and it's not something people beat. It's something you either require repeated dilatations for or an eventual resection, which you likely would have a trach for a short period of time during that resection for recovery. So that's not an avenue I want to take. But what it does for me is it's basically scar tissue that builds up in my trachea. They don't know what it's caused from. There's a few theories out there, but none of them are really proven, except for there is an autoimmune disease which could cause it, but it's also, and more awareness needs to be done about this for sure. It also relates to previous intubations. So if an anesthesiologist uses a breathing tube that's too big for your airway, they could cause damage to the tissue inside of your trachea. Or if they're using something called a cuff manometer that measures the pressure of that tube in the trachea and it's too high, it impedes the blood flow to the tissue in the trachea. And that can cause necrosis of the tissue, which causes the scar tissue. And it's just like if you had a scab on your hand from a cut, it keeps growing back. So there are different procedures being researched, mostly through the US and UK from what I've learned so far. But for now, I need repeated dilatations. And Christina, you know that I've already had 2 in the last year. And I'm going for my 3rd soon. So it's quite distressing that I was able to go 6.5 years. And everybody in that subglottic stenosis community that I'm involved in is just in awe. Like, how did you get 6.5 years? And now COVID starts and I need 3 in less than a year. So it's quite a thing for me to live with this and care for Nikki, because it gets to the point where having a conversation, leaving a voicemail message, I get very out of breath. And any exertion, climbing the stairs, any exertion with caring for my daughter leaves me sounding like I might collapse from an asthma attack. And it leaves me feeling that way too. So for me, it's been very key to have a lot of help in my home caring for Nikki, particularly since COVID started and I'm having a lot more difficult breathing myself. With this condition, we cough a lot. We have to clear our throat a lot. So I want to have a mask that says it's not COVID.
Yeah.
It's very nerve-wracking to go out into public, into a grocery store, and you need to cough. I guess that's a way I could keep people away from me too, but keep your distance. It's definitely a challenge in caring for Nikki, that's for sure. And I'm doing that as a solo parent as well. So there's a lot on my plate in being her substitute decision maker and basically her CEO to her janitor to CEO is like what I like to say. And finding those moments of joy amongst it all. Trying to remember that that's what keeps us going.
I was going to ask you how you navigate, being a patient yourself alongside being a caregiver. I mean, that's on a surface value just it seems like a lot. It seems so heavy. But I think you just touched on that with what you just said is manifesting that joy and digging deep inside yourself to recognize those moments.
Yeah. Well, and I had my first surgery last October in 6.5 years. Was quite a scare for me, actually, because I have this amazing ENT surgeon who's done my surgeries for the last 12 years. And it didn't even dawn on me. We have a teaching hospital here. And I know with my daughter, a lot of residents are involved. And I really have to stand up tall and sometimes really strong to ask that they not be involved. Sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes she's just too complex. They don't have enough education behind them yet or experience. And in a teaching hospital, that's pretty much what we see are residents. So it never even dawned on me that my surgeon would allow a resident to attempt my surgery last October. And unfortunately, she had a really difficult time accessing my airway. And I was out for an hour and a half. I'm usually out for 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes tops, because it's a really quick surgery. So I knew something was wrong the moment I woke up. I have a mild sore throat, nowhere near as sore as you would get from strep throat. The recovery is actually pretty easy. And it gets to the point where when you need one, you're like, okay, I'm ready for this. There's no nerves or anxiety because as soon as you wake up, you'll be able to breathe better. But when I woke up from that surgery, I was in really rough shape. And it turned out, and he owned up to it, I let a resident try and access your airway and she was having difficulty. So I took over. But it was too late. She damaged my vocal cords. I couldn't speak for a month. I still don't have my singing voice back for my daughter. I had a submandibular gland blockage in my neck, which was a big lump, and it was very painful, and it took me to emerge a couple of days after. And I had nerve damage done to my tongue as well, and the pain was insurmountable. So it reminded me that, gee, I have to do this for myself too, because as caregivers, we all too often forget to do that for ourselves. Fortunately, my surgeon is really good. And the next time I saw him and the next time I needed another surgery, we talked about it every time. And he was the one on my consent form for my next surgery to write no residents. And he said, remind me the day of, but I didn't even have to because the resident came to get me from the hallway. And she's wheeling me in on the stretcher and introducing herself. And she said, don't worry, I won't be working on you. We all know. So it's a really intimidating task to do, but it's really not that hard. Speak up. And if you have concerns about it, talk to your doctor about it.
Say something.
Yeah. Even right now with COVID, can you please wash your hands again? Mm-hmm. I know you may have already, but can you do that again for me, please? Mm-hmm. Even if it's as simple as washing their hands.
I just have to ask this, and I hope it's not inappropriate, but where do you get the strength?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I can answer that. Chris. I think, well, maybe I can. When you have a child, you will do anything you can to protect your child. So I will often ask people, if you saw a truck speeding down the road and your child was in the way, what would you do? You would race to your child's side in an adrenaline rush and get them out of the way. And basically, that's what I've been doing for 28 years. It's exhausting. There's many, many times that I will collapse into a messy puddle on the floor. And here's your answer. It's my support system. And it's my daughter's smile. The way she looks at me when she sees me and gives me this big smile. The way she giggles when I read to her. The way she laughs at the Comedy Station or Big Bang Theory. The way she tries to sing along to some of her favorite Shania Twain songs. And we had no family nearby when Nikki was born. All of my family live most of my family, not all of my family, live in the western provinces of Canada, and I'm in Ontario. I do have a brother here and some nieces and nephews, but they do live a drive away, and my brother's been very good at checking in on me, and he's come to help me a lot with my house, especially since I've been a solo parent. But I also have a really, really great team of people who work in my home. It's very intrusive. It's very invasive. I have no privacy. But I also have developed extremely wonderful relationships with all of these people, and that's really enhanced my life. And even more so, it's really enhanced Nikki's life. All of her care workers, the majority of them, and nurses are around her age. So it's almost like party time for them all the time. They always have her music going. They always have something fun that they're doing. This morning, she was getting a spa date, getting her feet done. And it's just, she's lost a lot in her life with COVID by losing her day program and losing her overnight respite program. But we've made the best of it with care in the home and with people who really want to be here and really want to help. Not only her, but they want to help me too. And then with COVID, I have an incredible community. A lot of them in my community know about my situation, so I might put a message out on the Facebook group saying, is anybody running to Costco? Can someone pick something up for me from Costco? Does anybody here work at Victoria Hospital? Can someone pick up a prescription there for me? So the community rallies behind me. It's really important not to hide. Because if you hide, you isolate yourself even more. And it's really
to feel
important
comfortable in asking.
Yes. And you want to do it all, but it's just not possible. My daughter is 24/7 care. And when COVID hit, I lost her day program. I lost her overnight respite. They've been closed since the start of COVID, so for a year and a half. I've lost over 4,700 hours of out-of-home support since COVID started. There is no way that one person can do all of that. I promote self-care. Do I get self-care?
I was going to ask you about
Not
that.
as much as I promote it.
Yeah. What does that look like for you?
But everybody gets to, for me, it's having the opportunity to sleep in. So if I've got a morning that isn't booked, and if I've got a morning where I've got care workers that I feel comfortable with handling all of Nikki's care, then I do that. If I've got a morning where I'm able to overlap the overnight person and the morning person, and I know that there's two people there, it's letting go of the fact that I need to check in with the person who's been here overnight. I can let that person who's been here overnight report to the morning person, and I can get that report from the morning person. I know if there wasn't a knock at my door, that everything's fine. And it's building that trust in those people. And that's literally, Nikki didn't sleep through the night until she was 7. And I didn't get overnight help until 4 years ago. So I had done the overnights for that many years. Now she wasn't awake all of those nights. I was able to sleep, but if she woke, I would have to deal with that. And I worked full time until she was 11. So for me now, I feel like I have a lifetime of rest to catch up on. So my moments of self-care involve allowing myself some mornings during the week or on the weekend to sleep in when I can. And I book people just so I can do that. For some, and actually, some people will say, take a few minutes in the bathroom. To me, that's not self-care. Unless you're relaxing in a nice, hot, bubbly bathtub with maybe a bubbly in your glass.
Yep.
But no, don't tell people to take a few minutes extra in the bathroom, because that to me is for bodily functions and hygiene. Unless it's the bath, of course, or a nice relaxing bath where you're not going to be interrupted. Mm-hmm. And I posted something on my personal Facebook page the other day, and it was me with my hair all wet with the phone up to my ear, because I literally on Friday spent 5 hours advocating for something that should have been simple for my daughter. And it wasn't, and it was time sensitive. So the moment I got out of the shower, I was getting phone calls. So I was on hold with one doctor's office, trying to dry my hair while I was on hold and keeping track of, at least it said where I was in the queue. So that's sometimes what advocating looks for me. Sometimes I have to do it while I'm blow drying my hair. And so to make up for those moments, we really do need to try and find time to ourselves. And on the weekend, I was able to travel about an hour away from where I am and visit the beach at night to see the sun setting and hear the sound of the waves. And then, as luck would have it, there was a family there setting off fireworks. Mm. So it's just taking those moments when you can and really letting them sink in and soak up those moments. And even every night we have a trouble competition with my daughter. Every single night without fail, we have to play the trouble game. You know, the pop. She loves the games that make sound. And we can get pretty dramatic. We get pretty competitive. So we have a lot of fun. And for about literally 45 minutes to an hour every night, we play Trouble. And that is a highlight of all of our days.
You are an inspiration.
Thank you, Chris.
So tell us about your podcast and the guests that you have, and how that's going for you.
Yes. So I was approached by caregiving.com to help them relaunch the Caring Conversations podcast. And I love how they are relaunching it. They're relaunching it in 2 seasons. So I'm hosting the first season, and my season is going to focus on parents and others who raise children with disabilities and complex needs. And I'd like to take the listeners on the journey of raising a child from early on in diagnosis into adulthood, and what that looks like for those families. For those who are on the sidelines looking in, they'll see what that looks like for those families and find ways that they can help support them. And for those families that are living it, they'll find inspiration, hope, ideas that will help them in their own journey as well.
What an awesome topic to cover in this vast network of caregiving that's often overlooked.
Yes, it is often overlooked. There's a lot of emphasis on, especially since the start of COVID, long-term care and the formal caregivers,
right?
Which is incredibly important. The long-term care crisis is devastating. But there's an assumption and an expectation that those parents who are raising children with disabilities and complex needs or chronic illnesses or acute illnesses, it's just part of the job of caring for your child. Everybody's expected to care for their child. But none of those parents expect to become a PhD or an honorary nurse or an honorary doctor. Literally, when my daughter's at home, I'm making all of those medical decisions. And in fact, I've managed a lot of her acute illnesses at home with the help of doctors over the phone, particularly since COVID started. But when we go into the hospital, that autonomy is taken away. If I want to give her an extra dose of Tylenol, I have to ask a doctor's approval. And they might say no. Whereas at home, I just give it. Mm-hmm. So it's a delicate balance sometimes between managing raising your child, but managing raising your child with such medical needs, and you become an expert in that. You really do. And that's not what you expect. When you, in my case, when I was expecting to have this baby and raise this baby, I didn't expect a world of medicine. And for some families, maybe their child has acquired a brain injury, or they're suffering from cancer, or they've had an injury. And they will be suffering also the loss of who their child was previous to that. For me, it was suffering the loss of what I thought it was going to be like raising a baby and what I thought my daughter's life would be like. Mm-hmm. The fact that I'll never be a grandmother. Things like that. And every time we have to put our child through a medical procedure that will cause them pain, it causes us a lot of pain. We feel very helpless because we're supposed to be protecting our child from pain, but here we are subjecting them to it. And there's no stopping the guilt that a parent can feel over something like that.
What are some other, what I like to call normal caregiving thoughts or feelings that you've experienced? I know guilt comes up a lot for caregivers of all shapes and sizes, but I'd like to hear more about your experience with some of those uncomfortable feelings.
I think the most uncomfortable feeling I have, I'm going to hit it head on here, is the fear of her dying. Mm. She's already lived double her life expectancy. And that's from the moment she was born. And we expect that our parents are going to go before us. And we expect that there might be some caregiving as they age. We don't typically expect that we will outlive our children. and the heartache and the heartbreak that we go through. Like watching her almost die on Mother's Day when she was 15 was incredibly difficult. Going into the hospital for emergency, I avoid that as much as I can. Sometimes to a fault. And when COVID started last year, she had her first pancreatitis attack that she'd had in 3.5 years, of course, right at the start of COVID. And I have my contacts at the hospital. I let them know if I'm bringing her in. They kind of get the system, the process started. It's helped me out a lot in the past. I've made those connections and it's really helped me out. So the coordinator contacted the inpatient doctor on service. He called me and he said, if you can manage this at home, we are here for you, but I think it would be best for her if you manage this at home because of the fear of COVID. And I had managed pancreatitis attacks at home prior, but since that time, she's developed diabetes because of all the damage that's happened to her pancreas from the attacks. So now I'm managing extremely high blood sugars. My anxiety is through the roof. And I'm basically providing acute care to her in my home on my own at a time that the world is shutting down and everybody is in fear. I'm in even greater fear because there was also, if I had to take her in, the risk that I couldn't be at her side. And if I'm not hands-on, eyes on her, her health outcomes will be negatively impacted. I can guarantee you that. Yeah. They cannot take care of her in the hospital on their own. They can't have 5 other acutely ill patients and meet my daughter's needs because they are constant. Right. And she can't press a call button. She suffered a lung collapse in the hospital 4.5 years ago, and they wouldn't have known how it happened if I wasn't at her side. And she had just started choking, but they wouldn't have been there to help her with that. So getting back to the start of COVID, we had not met her brand new endocrinologist yet. Her former one had retired in December. And the gastroenterologist and the inpatient doctor got in touch with him. We had a consult with him the following month. And they got in touch with him to help me manage her blood sugars at home. And when he called me, and keep in mind, I still haven't met this man. And he's been an incredible support over the last 1.5 years. But we still haven't met because of COVID. But that first phone call, he was quite upset with me. And he said, you have to take her in. You can't manage this by yourself at home. And I said, well, doctor, with all due respect, you don't know me. And once that all resolved and we had our official first consult, he said to me, wow, I didn't think you'd be able to do it. And he was truly, truly impressed. And not that that's something to be particularly proud of, because it's really, 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 really hard. But it's establishing those support systems that help me get through it. The help with her direct care, the help from physicians who will be there by my side, even if it's over the phone, who are available, who will help me. And then the community support system as well. And don't get me wrong, I've had to advocate harder than I have ever had to advocate before in Nikki's life. in this last year and a half. And it is incredibly draining. But having those support systems in place is absolutely key.
And what a support system you are to the parents out there that are on similar journeys with different diagnoses. Mm-hmm. I'm not a parent. I've watched my sisters and my brother, and this is what you are doing as an advocate, not only for your daughter and for yourself, but for the other people out there who are in these similar situations that need a like-minded individual like yourself. Is kind of what we're all called to do in this vast network of caregiving.
You know, I've just come up with an acronym. Been thinking about it for the last couple of days, and I don't know if I have it completely final, but I'll put the idea out there for you. What can you do for a caregiver? You can give them hugs. And even though if we can't hug physically in this time with COVID in our lives, you can help them. So help. Even hear what they have to say. You can help them unplug, or you can unite with them for a purpose, and you can give them your support, whether it's picking something up at the grocery store or the pharmacy, taking them out for a walk, giving them some help with their loved ones so they can get out. You know, there was one time I had no support one day, and I had one of her care workers on FaceTime to keep an eye on her while I took a break and had lunch in the kitchen. And that care worker would text me if she needed a suction, but it gave me that few moments. So you need to be really innovative with your ideas too. So give them support in any which way you can. Buy them a parking pass at the hospital. Buy them a meal. Make them a casserole. Give them something. And then for us, hold space for them. So that's what you can do for caregivers in your life. Give them hugs.
It's beautiful.
I wish I could hug you right through this virtual studio.
Here you go, Chris.
We're all about the virtual hugs here.
So, Christina, I think we need to create Hug a Caregiver Day.
I love it.
I love that.
And in honor of Brenda and the great work.
Aww.
It's not work. It's passion and love.
Yes.
It's not work.
Thank you. I love that.
So just consider that done. That's something we're going to institute. Hug a Caregiver Day.
Oh,
We could probably talk forever, which is wonderful. But is there anything else that you'd like to? I mean, we've pretty much peeled the onion today. It's just been such a
I could go on and on
conversation. But
I could go on and on. You know, there's something I want to say too. And this is something I've brought up with a guest in my podcast. We hold space for each other. Those who are caregivers hold space for each other in ways that, unfortunately, those who aren't caregivers can't quite understand. So the example we used is this guest I had. Her and I have known each other for years, since our daughters were little. I didn't know her story. And she didn't know Nikki's story. Because it's not relevant to how our daughters acquired their disabilities. And I think we also have this understanding that there's so much energy taken from us for repeating our stories to the health professionals. We don't put that drain on each other. So she actually had cancer when she was pregnant. I never knew that. I never knew that this little friend that Nikki had was born prematurely because her mom had cancer. And our girls are in their 20s. So it's not important how they got to where they are today. What's important is that we give our children all the love and care that we can, and we give our friends and other caregivers all the love and care and space that we can. If the caregiver is going to tell you their story, they will find that time.
Right.
But it is exhausting to repeat the story, so let them find that time.
I get it. Because there are no strangers when it comes to caregivers.
No, you're absolutely right.
Oh, boy. Wow. So, where can all of our listeners find more information about you and follow you on social media and all that?
Sure. My website is www.coachingforcaregiverscanada.com. They can also find my profile on caregiving.com. They can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Coaching for Caregivers Canada. And they can find me on LinkedIn with my name, Brenda Blais, Blais Nesbitt, Nesbitt.
Well, thank you so much, Brenda. I obviously connected with you maybe a year and a half ago now. And just to actually hear all of your story in full was just such an honor to, as you have pointed out, hold space or make space for that today. And I'll be sitting with your story undoubtedly in the days and weeks to come.
Well, thank you for holding space for me today.